Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Shadow Warrior 3 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Flying Wild Hog and published by Devolver Digital in March of this year. It is of course the sequel to Shadow Warrior 2, which itself was the sequel to the 2013 reboot of the Shadow Warrior franchise. Upon its original release, Shadow Warrior 3 got a bit of a mixed reception overall, namely for things like the very short campaign and the very hit-or-miss humor depending on who was reviewing the game at any given point. And with it having clearly taken some influence from the 2016 reboot of Doom as well as Doom Eternal, people were frequently saying things along the lines of, this is basically what happens when you say we have Doom Eternal at home. And between the comparisons to Doom Eternal and the fact that Shadow Warrior 2 just wasn't a very good game, I was actually pretty concerned going into Shadow Warrior 3 that I was really going to hate it. So, what ended up happening with Shadow Warrior 3? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on Unreal Engine 4 and generally looks very good. It's got good modeling, good textures, good animations, and more particle effects and blood and gore than you can shake a stick at. And it's all rendered with a bright, colorful, stylized aesthetic that fits the game very well. This also includes weapon designs that just plain look cool, and enemy designs that are wonderfully demented, so you take great pleasure in sending them back to the nether realm from whence they came. And this is all accompanied by a clean, easy-to-read interface that is still nonetheless very fitting with the style, as well as very solid feedback when you're running around fighting things. There are really only two major problems with the visuals. The first of them is the aforementioned particle effects. Those often also include a lot of very bright flashing lights that are pretty grating on someone who doesn't have photosensitivity issues, let alone someone who does. So be warned, if you have issues with photosensitivity, you probably don't want to play Shadow Warrior 3. I've tried to include as few clips of the bright flashing lights as I can throughout this video. Thankfully, it's only a major problem in certain parts of the game, but it is still an issue that is worth mentioning. The other issue with the visuals is with regards to the cutscenes, which are not very well animated, and which are all pre-rendered cutscenes that are apparently in corrupted video file encoding or something, because the frame rate on them is very choppy and the lip syncing doesn't actually sync up to anything, resulting in the cutscenes just looking kind of awful. I don't know what they did to achieve that, but that's something that they definitely should have fixed over the past several months, and they just haven't. So, not sure what the hell's going on there. But apart from those two glaring issues, the rest of the visuals look quite good, and the performance is also quite solid. I didn't really run into any major frame rate dips throughout the entire experience, and it was usually going well over 100 frames per second most of the time. And when the frame rate did start to drop, it was in places and times when it made sense, like a lot of things going on screen at once, or in very wide open areas with lots of enemies there, and things like that. Even then, it still never really went below 80 frames per second, so they've definitely done a pretty good job of optimizing it, although obviously your mileage is going to vary depending on what hardware you're running. But then you move over into sound design, and that's where things become more of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you have the soundtrack, which is an interesting mix of basically like if you tried to take ancient Chinese martial arts themed films and such, and tried to turn that into the backing tracks for hip-hop songs, as well as some electronic stuff and a bit of semi-industrial that, as I'm describing it, probably sounds pretty awful, but it actually works pretty well throughout the game. You don't really notice it all that much, but when it does really start to kick in, it can actually be really catchy. Then we move over into voice acting, and things become a bit rougher. On the one hand, the voice cast themselves do a pretty decent job with what they're given, but there are two potential issues with this. The first of them is that they completely changed out the voice cast compared to the previous games. Some people who were especially fond of the cast from the previous games might be rather bothered by this, but frankly, I don't think it matters all that much. The new cast do a pretty good job, and in the case of Lo Wang in particular, you'd frankly be hard-pressed to tell the difference between the voice actor from the Shadow Warrior reboot and Shadow Warrior 2 and the voice of Lo Wang in this particular game. They are very, very close. Unfortunately, despite the cast giving pretty decent performances, the lines they're actually given to say usually aren't all that great. They'll get the job done in terms of pushing the story along, but in terms of the jokes, most of them fall pretty flat. Now granted, that's not really surprising if you've played either of the two previous rebooted Shadow Warrior games, but if you are familiar with those two games, you can tell they at least tried to improve the humor in Shadow Warrior 3, and it just doesn't really work all that well. And I think the best way to describe this may sound a bit odd at first glance, but just bear with me here. Imagine if you took the fairly recent Deadpool movies with Ryan Reynolds and removed nearly all of the fourth wall breaking and all of the self-aware parody elements. You would end up with something along the lines of what they tried to do with the humor in Shadow Warrior 3. A lot of what makes the Deadpool movies enjoyable is the fact that they are fully self-aware, basically parodies of superhero films instead of just being straight superhero films. And if you were to reduce or outright remove that angle, then they frankly just wouldn't work. The Shadow Warrior reboot series suffers from a similar issue as to what I'm describing. Shadow Warrior 3 in particular is set up in such a way to where if they went the extra step and made it more of a straight up parody of action games, then it would actually work a lot better. Instead, most of the humor is centered around how basically all of the principal characters are just complete assholes. And while you might get a chuckle out of that at first, it very quickly becomes tiresome, and the humor just ends up falling flat throughout the vast majority of the game. I mean, sure, there's the occasional moment where it becomes more self-aware, like when you get access to the grappling hook and it pokes fun at the fact that grappling hooks are becoming something of a staple in modern games. But things like that are very few and far between in favor of constant reminders of, haha, look at how much of a fuck-up and asshole Lo Wang is, and haha, look at Zilla, he used to have everything and now he has nothing. By the way, did I mention he's an asshole? And as I said, that just gets extremely tiresome. So what else is there in the audio presentation? Well, there's perhaps the most disappointing element of it, which is the sound effects themselves. The general sound effects for moving around and such like that are fine, and the sounds of enemies getting blown apart or chopped apart into meaty chunks and those chunks flying around and such are fairly good. But then there are the gun and explosion sounds, which are very much on the weaker side. There are a couple of weapons that do actually sound relatively beefy, like the Basilisk Railgun, for example. But most of the weapons in this really are quite low impact, and that can be to their severe detriment, especially in the case of things like the shotgun, which should be awesome. I mean, it's a pump-action revolving shotgun. It's completely impractical, it's huge, and it has a pretty good effect on target, so you would think it would sound awesome. And it just doesn't, unfortunately. So that ends up being really disappointing, and when you are throwing grenades around and explosions are happening, those are also fairly low impact, so you just end up with a situation where the weapons have a fairly satisfying effect on target, but that's mostly from what you're seeing them do to enemies and not what you're actually hearing as you're blasting or slashing or whatever. So that just ends up being severely disappointing, and when you look at the audio design as a whole, it, as I said before, ends up being a very mixed bag, which, when you bring it together with the visuals, ultimately makes the entire presentation really a mixed bag, although at least the visuals help to compensate a fair bit. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set after the events of the Shadow Warrior reboot in Shadow Warrior 2, where Lo Wang feels like he's lost his mojo after trying and failing to take down the world-destroying giant dragon that is just flying around and eating everything. And while he's running around in the Wang cave complaining about this to the mask of his now dead friend, the demon god Hoji, Zilla shows up with a last-ditch plan to try to take down the dragon that will involve the mask of Hoji as well as the last remaining sorceress on the planet, Motoko, with the alternative basically just being that the entire world just gets annihilated. Without much better to do, Lo Wang gears up and heads off with Zilla to try to take down the dragon, and that's really the entire plot. They do introduce a couple of twists at certain points, but it's stuff you can see coming from a mile away, and the story is really nothing special at all. If anything, whenever it interrupts your gameplay to throw a cutscene in your face, All you really want is for the game to shut up so you can go back to shooting things. Now, of course, this really shouldn't be surprising if you're familiar with the previous two Shadow Warrior games, neither of which had much going on in terms of the story, and were really all about the gameplay. The problem was, in the case of Shadow Warrior 2, that gameplay was turning everything into a looter shooter and making it just plain crap. So, what did they do with Shadow Warrior 3? Well, they brought it back to more along the lines of what the first Shadow Warrior reboot was doing, but they have clearly taken a lot of influence from Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. What do I mean by that? Well, like with the first reboot game, this is really not very much like the original Shadow Warrior from '97. This is more along the lines of something like Serious Sam, where you'll be thrown into a combat arena, it'll lock you off, and then you have to fight a bunch of enemies until eventually you clear them all out, and then you can move on. There's a pretty good variety of enemy types, each of which has their own attack patterns that you'll have to keep in mind, although it's nowhere near like what you had to do in Doom Eternal, where every single enemy had one specific way that the game wanted you to beat it, and you had to just memorize that and go to it every single time you encountered one of those enemies, otherwise you would be wasting ammo on them endlessly. Shadow Warrior 3, on the other hand, more opts for the tried and true classic approach of, pro tip, to defeat insert enemy here, shoot at it until it dies. Sure, you can get headshots on some of the enemies, but most of the time you're just going to be running around and blasting the living crap out of anything that's in your path. This does present a bit of a dilemma because many of the enemy types that you'll be encountering later on in the game have a very large amount of health. And that problem is, well, what happens when you start running out of ammo? Well, if this were Doom Eternal, then you would have to stop whatever it was you were doing and go find a fodder enemy, press the chainsaw button, wait through the canned animation of you chainsawing the enemy to bits, and then wait for the ammo shower to come out and collect all of that, then go back to whatever it was you were doing. In Shadow Warrior, on the other hand, you don't stop whatever it was you were doing and go find a fodder enemy. You just press the right mouse button, which will draw and slash your katana, and then you keep pressing the right mouse button to keep slashing the katana as you watch ammo shower out of enemies whenever you hit them with the sword. And as if that weren't enough, you can always just go and find the ammo pickups that are scattered around the arena, because there's always going to be an ammo pickup somewhere in the arena. And it even has a respawn timer, so if you pick it up and the fight goes on long enough, then that ammo will respawn and you can just go right back and pick it up again. So at first you might think that it would have the same problem that Doom Eternal has, where you would be constantly stopping and restarting your combat loop because you had to go find ammo somewhere, but since you never actually have to stop whatever it is you're doing to sit through canned animations or go find a fodder enemy to chop up, it's never really a problem. And this brings me to another question you might have if you're familiar with Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, which is, well, how do they handle health? Because in 2016 and Doom Eternal, much like when you inevitably ran out of ammo because the ammo capacity was too low, at least in Doom Eternal, you would have to stop whatever it was you were doing and go find a fodder enemy or some other enemy that was heavily damaged and blast them until they start flashing with an outline. Once they started flashing with an outline, then you could go up to them and press a button and it would go through a canned animation of a melee takedown called a glory kill, and then that would cause a bunch of health to fly out of the enemy. In other words, having the same exact effect that chainsawing an enemy to get ammo would have, where you're just constantly stopping and then restarting your combat loop. Well, Shadow Warrior solves that problem not only by having health pickups in the arena, much like they do with the ammo pickups, but also by having health fly out of enemies when you shoot them. So you never actually interrupt whatever it is you're doing to go and get ammo or health. You're just constantly in the combat loop. The only time you have to sit through a canned animation a la glory kills or chainsawing in Doom Eternal is when you choose, not when you have to, when you choose to use a finisher. What are finishers? Well, you have a meter that builds up, and it starts out with 2 charges, and eventually you'll unlock a 3rd charge, where you can use it on an enemy to do a finisher animation, much like a glory kill, and then you get some sort of bonus. Now, with the most basic enemy you encounter right at the beginning, you rip their head off and then smash it to get 100 health points. With the second enemy, you punch their face off, grab their eyeball and brain, and then throw that, and it is basically like an ice grenade. It will freeze enemies in place for a brief period. Other finishers include pulling a crank gun out of an enemy's body, and then that crank gun shoots fireworks at enemies, or ripping an enemy's arm off and using that as a sledgehammer, or just stomping out an enemy's eyeball and then that zips around you and automatically attacks enemies. One even gives you a grenade-type weapon that you throw, and then it will cause a singularity that pulls enemies in and does damage to them while also making them easier to blast yourself. In other words, you're not sitting through finisher animations just to get your health back or just to get your ammo back. You're choosing, whenever you want to go through one of these animations, to get a special, powerful bonus weapon or bonus health. And there's even a bit of strategy to it, where your meter has to build up over time. You get meter back by attacking and killing enemies, of course. And for those more powerful bonus weapons, you need more charges on the meter to be able to use them. So for the most powerful ones, you need all 3 charges, whereas with others you might only need 1, or you might need 2. And if you don't want to use the finisher animations, you just want to constantly run around shooting and slashing things, you certainly can. There's nothing stopping you from doing that because the finishers are completely optional outside of the moment where they tutorialize it for you. But really the vast majority of your time in Shadow Warrior 3 is going to be running around and blasting the living crap out of everything, and of course slashing the living crap out of everything, with a fairly limited but very useful arsenal. You have the basic revolver, which is good for fairly accurate shots, although it doesn't really have all that much power behind it, of course. You have a shotgun, which is a pump-action revolver shotgun, which is really silly looking, but hey, it's a shotgun that works pretty well. You have dual submachine guns. You have a grenade launcher type weapon that's pretty straightforward. You have a railgun type weapon, and you have a saw blade launcher. These weapons are pretty useful throughout the entire game, but they get more useful as you upgrade them. You see, you'll find upgrade points scattered throughout the levels, both for your character and for the weapons, and by spending these upgrade points you will be able to improve the various weapons' ammo capacity, as well as give them some extra traits, like the revolver, for example, will eventually be able to set enemies on fire, whereas the railgun will be able to shoot through enemies and just keep going. The one that should be a no-brainer, however, is the one that turns the shotgun into a fully automatic weapon where you don't have to reload it at any point and you just keep holding down the fire button to keep shooting shells. Now, unfortunately, this means that you're not experiencing the weapons at their fullest potential and most satisfying nature until much later on in the game when you've earned enough upgrade points to unlock those upgrades. But thankfully, the weapons never feel underpowered as a result of not having the upgrades. It just feels like they get more powerful after you get those. So they've at least done a decent job with that, but what they haven't really done as good a job with are the character upgrades. You'll get character upgrade points as you go throughout the levels as well, and you can spend those on improving things like the amount of health you have, or making the effects from the various exploding barrels that you'll find occasionally in the levels more potent, or things like that. But one of the more interesting things you can get from that is the ability to use special katana moves, like what you had in the Shadow Warrior reboot as well as Shadow Warrior 2, where you can do things like send out energy blades when you slash your katana, or do a more powerful strike with them. And the way you do that is by holding down the right mouse button in the case of PC or whatever it is on console, and then using the directional movement to determine which move you're going to use. But while these moves add some flair to the game, they don't really serve all that much purpose in the general gameplay loop. It's just a neat thing you can do if you choose to unlock it. And in fact, throughout my entire playthrough, I was so much more concerned with switching weapons and just constantly going back and forth between the various guns that I almost completely forgot that I actually had access to the moves. And when I did remember I had access to them, I just said, you know what, I've been doing fine thus far without them, I don't really need them. And that probably shouldn't be surprising given that they're put behind the character unlock system and are not just something that is given to you. Anything that you actually need to be able to play through the entire campaign is given to you, and usually pretty early on. I mean, the very first level of the game gives you the revolver and the shotgun, as well as, of course, the katana. And then the next level after that, after you accept Zilla's offer, you get the dual machine guns, and you just keep going from there. So you get your full arsenal very quickly, which also addresses one of the major problems that Doom Eternal had, where because you didn't have your full arsenal until rather late into the game, you weren't actually able to play the game the way the developers intended it to be played, which was clearly with the entire arsenal because, again, those enemies are designed to be beaten in one specific way, no matter what Doom Eternal fanboys will tell you. Shadow Warrior 3 has neither of these problems because you get access to the full arsenal very quickly, and the enemies are not designed with a very rigid gameplay loop in mind. They're just enemies with their own specific capabilities, and you can go about defeating them however you feel is most efficient for you. And when everything is firing on all cylinders, the combat loop of Shadow Warrior 3 is fairly satisfying. Sure, the gun and explosion sounds are fairly weak, but the visible effect on target is pretty satisfying. The enemies have those weird, demented designs, and it makes them all the more satisfying to blast to bits. The movement itself is fast and responsive, and you also get access to the grappling hook, which is not always used effectively in the combat arenas, but is still there for some extra spice if you choose to use it. And there's even big traps in a lot of the environments that you can lure enemies into and then just eviscerate them by triggering the trap, which is always satisfying. And in between the combat areas, you have a bit of time to cool down as you go through a platforming sequence, which is, frankly, very easy throughout the entire game, but it also actually makes sense because, well, Lo Wang is a ninja, and you would expect him to be doing things like running up walls and running along walls, and doing a whole lot of grappling hook swinging and things like that. And despite the story being crap, the characters all being basically one note, and the humor constantly falling flat, Shadow Warrior 3 does end up being a fairly enjoyable experience overall, although it is a very short game with very little in the way of replayability. I completed it in around 4 hours, and the only thing after that was just New Game Plus, which I didn't feel like going through after having completed the main campaign. I was more or less done with the entire gameplay loop of Shadow Warrior 3 at that point. There's only so much of this gameplay style that a player can take before it starts to become too repetitive and just eventually tiresome. And Shadow Warrior 3 was starting to hit that point right around when the game ended, so it didn't manage to overstay its welcome, unlike, say, Doom Eternal, which was completely and utterly exhausting because it massively overstayed its welcome. And speaking of, I know I've been doing a lot of comparing this game to Doom Eternal, and some of you might be a bit annoyed by that. You might think I'm trying to rile up the Doom Eternal fanboys or something like that. I am not trying to rile up the fanboys. The simple fact of the matter is that Shadow Warrior 3 took a lot of design cues from Doom Eternal, and as a result, I simply can't avoid comparing the two games. This is not a good thing for either of the two games, I might add. It's not a good thing for Doom Eternal because the experience of playing through Doom Eternal was abject misery, and it just was completely and utterly exhausting, so I wanted absolutely nothing more to do with it after I got my review done. And I specifically said that if that was how first-person shooters were going to be going forward, then I don't want anything to do with them going forward. So just the act of remembering the experience of Doom Eternal put me in a bad enough mood already. But then there was the fact that Shadow Warrior 3 has all of these design cues, and while it does do many of these things frankly outright better than Doom Eternal did, I still couldn't avoid thinking about Doom Eternal the entire time I was playing through Shadow Warrior 3, which in turn put me in this really weird mental space, where when I was having fun with Shadow Warrior 3, it's because the game was feeling more like the Shadow Warrior reboot than anything else. Then the Doom Eternal aspects would start rearing their ugly head, and it would put me back into more of a bad mood, and I would just constantly go back and forth between having fun with the Shadow Warrior elements and not having fun with the Doom Eternal elements. And while that was immensely frustrating, it wasn't anywhere near as exhausting as the experience of playing through Doom Eternal was, so by default, Shadow Warrior 3 is a much more enjoyable game than Doom Eternal. And if you're a Doom Eternal fanboy and about to bitch at me about that, I frankly don't care. Because at the end of the day, Shadow Warrior 3 is not a particularly great game either. It's certainly better than Shadow Warrior 2 was, but it's still not as enjoyable as the Shadow Warrior reboot was, or especially the original Shadow Warrior. And given the game's very short length, it's a bit difficult to recommend at the price point that it's at, which is about $40 US right now. If you can get it on sale, you might be able to get something out of it, but the simple fact of the matter is that at best, Shadow Warrior 3 is still just a decent game. And if you're looking for a Shadow Warrior experience that is going to be more robust and have, of course, more content to it and just generally feel better, then you might as well just go back and play the 2013 reboot or, of course, the original Shadow Warrior from 1997. But you know what? At least Shadow Warrior 3 is a hell of a lot better than the looter-shooter garbage that was Shadow Warrior 2, so I gotta give them that at least. And overall, I give this a 3 out of 5 with that simple caveat of if you're going to get into Shadow Warrior 3, make sure that you pick it up when it's on sale for a good price, because there is so little content on offer here. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.